June 19th commemorates more than just a celebration of freedom. This date marks the beginning of a new nation. A nation that further sought to uphold the values stated in the Declaration of Independence of all men being created equal. The holiday of Juneteenth is meant to acknowledge and celebrate the joy of the newly freed slaves. In the midst of the American Civil War, which began in 1861, President Lincoln became aware of the massive numbers of slaves fleeing from the South to the North. Lincoln used these occurrences to convince his constituents that abolition was a sane war strategy. On September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued an initial Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that all slaves were to be free, effective on January 1, 1863. Although the emancipation was issued, slaveholders did not find it necessary to comply and obey the proclamation. One of the states that refused to comply with the orders of the document was the state of Texas. During the Civil War, Texas was not a site for very many battles. Therefore, it remained rather insulated and unaffected by Union forces. At this time, the state's borders were guarded by Confederate troops. This tight-knit insulation of the state created the perfect scenario to continue participating in the illegal act of slavery. In fact, in order to continue to salvage the labor of the slaves, slave owners in the freed states of Mississippi and Alabama would send their slaves to Texas. It is estimated that tens of thousands of slaves were added to the previous population of 180,000 slaves already located in Texas. Due to the Union General Gordon Granger and his 1,800 troops on June 2, 1865, Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith finally surrendered to the Union forces. Once General Granger arrived with his 1,800 troops, he went directly to Ashton Villa in Galveston, Texas, and read General Order No. 3, which began with his most famous documented words: "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and free laborer." When the slaves were informed that they were free, there were a plethora of reactions. Some danced and sang in the street. Others cried out shouts to God. And some were panged with confusion of how they were going to attain financial income. This quote from former slave Pierce Harper in 1937 captures the essence of the emotions the slaves felt after they had heard that they were free, when he recalls, "When peace come, they read the Emancipation Law to the colored people. They, the freed slaves, spent that night singing and shouting. They wasn't slaves no more."
So, General Gordon Granger went out onto Ashton Villa and he told the slaves that they were free. And in the streets, there was shouting, there was singing, there was dancing, because after all this time of being oppressed, after all this time of having to go through what they went through, they learned 2.5 years later, after all the other slaves in other states had been free, that they were going to be free. So you could understand their different emotions at this time. And then additionally, some slaves were crying out shouts to God, thanking him for bringing them through, because all the Negro spirituals that they sang, all the hymns, it finally resulted in a victory for the African American people. And on top of that, I guess another emotion that the slaves conveyed at this time was confusion, because not only confusion as to why they were the last to know, but also how were they going to attain financial income now that they were freed slaves. I guess that at that time they were just concerned as to how they were going to attain financial freedom, because they didn't have an education. The only life that they knew was the plantation. And so with their slave owners now forced to let them go thanks to the Union soldiers, you have all these slaves, 180,000 of them actually, confused and wondering how they were going to attain financial freedom. And so I think that their reactions are important to the Juneteenth celebration, because we see that, yes, it was a joyous time, but also it was time of questioning. It was a time of, how are we going to get from here to where our slave owners are? How are we going to build up as a community? And so now that the slave populace, or the former slave populace, was united, they all had the same question of, what are we going to do now?
So where did the slaves go? What did they do? A part of how they felt after they were freed was, a part of that was they wanted to get with their families, seeing as many of the slaves, when they came over to America, were split from their families and split from their loved ones. So many of them traveled throughout the bordering states trying to find their families, trying to connect with their families to reunite what they had once lost as a part of their Juneteenth celebration. Now, if you might recall, as you might have heard, many of the slaves traveled north to escape slavery. But as you can see now, seeing as the South really didn't even like the slaves in the first place, seeing as they weren't very happy once the slaves were freed. So the slaves really didn't have much opportunity in the South to be successful, not even successful, to sustain life, because the slave owners treated them still as slaves and paid them very, very low wages in the South, basically the minimum of what they had to do. So it was almost like borderline slavery, even though they were free. So many of the slaves, what you saw them do was they migrated to the North, seeing as the North, where there were African Americans that were already free, African Americans that had businesses, African Americans that had stable lives in the North, because the North was actually more accepting of the slaves. They were more anti-slavery than the South was. Now, there was definitely still discrimination and things such as that in the North, but what there was more opportunity, and many of the slaves went to the North so that they could have opportunities, so they could have a chance, so they could make money, so they could create jobs and different things for themselves. Many don't seem to understand that during this period of slavery in the North, that is where African Americans got their start in the world of business, in the world of moving on, in the world of technology and advancements. Seeing as many of these, different inventions that we have today were built and made by African Americans. So there had to be some educated slaves there, and there had to be some educated African Americans somewhere if they're making and creating these inventions, which date back to the 1800s. So clearly in the North, you had more educated people. So you had them migrating to the North, not only to give themselves an opportunity, but to give future generations opportunities to create, new lives for themselves, to create advancements, and to actually not only advance themselves, African Americans as a people, but also to advance the United States as a whole. What do I think led up to Juneteenth? Well, it's not necessarily what I think led up to Juneteenth. What led up to Juneteenth was just information being withheld from the slaves. And that's a big part of modern day society. When people don't have access to the information that's necessary, things are setting them back. We have major problems and we have major issues. And that really was just led up to Juneteenth was a mindset. The mindset of the South was to keep the slaves and to get as much money as they could from the slaves, and that the slaves were not worth anything at all. They were less than human. So therefore, what led up to Juneteenth was just the mindset and how they felt about slaves and how they felt that they should be treated and what they were necessary to be used for. So therefore, they withhold the information to continue to get profits from the slaves. I would definitely say Juneteenth has influenced blacks in business today. Many wouldn't, necessarily make that connection, seeing as it's not just like a bright line. Because of this, we have this, and they understand that connection between the blacks in business and Juneteenth. But if you really look at it today, if you really look at the concept and the idealism of Juneteenth, if you take away the whole slavery part, it's just it's a celebration of the advancement of black people. You can be generalize it and put it into the category of the civil rights movements, of all the marches, the speeches, even Obama being president. it was just another staple. It was kind of really the beginning of black people really overcoming something, seeing as, since the first slaves were freed, but, you had these people being held back. It's the first time in that generation, in that time, when you had all the slaves on the same page, when you had all the black people on that one same page, that they were no longer slaves. They all achieved that one advancement. So when you bring that to the blacks in business today, when you have all these African Americans doing these great things in the business world, what they're doing is they're advancing themselves. You have us as a community, us as African Americans. Not only are they advancing with their own businesses, what they're doing is they're bringing it to our communities. They're trying to enlighten our young African Americans into how to succeed in business, what to do. So as you can see here, it's really just an advancement of African Americans. So that definitely relates, and it's a celebration of that advancement. Seeing as the expo that we're here celebrating today, the gala that we're about to have tonight, it's the blacks in business. It's a celebration of the advancement of African Americans.
Juneteenth can be celebrated in many ways. Currently, in 2015, we celebrate it by having parades, festivals, and even at-home celebrations. There's picnics. So people recognize Juneteenth as a holiday, and they do celebrate it accordingly. I do believe Juneteenth is an important part of today's society, because Juneteenth was the starting point of African American advancement, and I think that that's important and it should be celebrated. And so when something like that occurs, when African Americans finally attained their freedom as a whole, as an entire populace, that should be celebrated. And it is important because if African Americans all started at the same place on June 19th, 1865, then that means that they can advance together. And so from that point, they were building businesses, they were making inventions. Honestly, I believe that the education system has not done its job in letting our young people know what Juneteenth is and why it should be celebrated. The reason why there are so many people, or African American people, in business today is due to Juneteenth. Because after the slaves were freed, they were able to go out and start their own businesses after trials and tribulations. Of course, I'm not saying that it was an easy road. However, that is what started, that was the catalyst for what started African Americans in business. And so I think that children are not hearing enough about it. And so it's not being celebrated like Martin Luther King Jr. Day is, where you get a whole day off of school. It's not being celebrated where we have to do whole reports on what Juneteenth is, as we did when we were learning about Rosa Parks or other figures. And so I think that it's important. Juneteenth is definitely important, and it should be celebrated. It should be celebrated amongst our youth. It should be celebrated amongst our elders, and our elders need to pass that knowledge that they have onto our youth, so that if the youth are not hearing it in school because the education system has somehow forgot to mention it, then it's the responsibility of the older generations to let the younger generations know why they are able to achieve what they achieve.
I do think Juneteenth has had an effect on today's society. I would probably go as far to say Juneteenth has had an incredibly poignant impact on modern businesses and global economies. The date of Juneteenth allowed African Americans to be more independent, start businesses, buy their own properties, all of which are symbols of advancement. However, it's to be noted that Black ingenuity did not just begin with Juneteenth. For example, Mansa Musa, the richest man in the world, was creating infrastructure, building colleges, and redefining Black advancement in 1280. So Juneteenth was truly a rebirth of African American ingenuity, and that has allowed for inventions such as the traffic light, refrigerator, and fire extinguisher to come into fruition. Juneteenth has not been an integral celebration in my upbringing. I had to take it upon myself to learn about the facts and what it's all about. I found a unique way to celebrate, though. I organized a barbecue where all my family and friends congregated and celebrated what our ancestors did for us. Absolutely. There are many notable figureheads that exemplify the ideologies of Juneteenth, men and women alike. Black entrepreneurs and inventors are some of the best examples of advancement after emancipation. Entrepreneurs such as Annie Malone, who was the first black female millionaire, founded Peru College, which was an institution that taught black women about quality hair care. Madam C.J. Walker, who attended Peru College, created a brand of hair care products for African American women and became a millionaire herself. John H. Johnson is another entrepreneur that started the founder of Johnson Publishing Company, which published magazines such as Ebony and Jet. There are obviously more entrepreneurs that exemplify and embody the advancements in Juneteenth, but those are just a few.